more really exciting stuff today, and that is all about how we think differently in different cultures, why we think differently in different cultures, and lots of examples of the causes of those different approaches to thinking. We're doing this because it's important for us as teachers to be aware of the different cultures there are in the world, to help us think about how we teach and ultimately help us in our choices of suitable methodology for our learners. So let's get started on this. In the picture, you can see a chicken, you can see some grass, and you can see a cow. What you need to do after I have counted to 3 is you need to decide which 2 go together. Is it the chicken and the cow that go together, or is it the cow and the grass? Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, you've got your decision. Now, let's look at some of the information on the decisions that have been made by people in different cultures. It would appear that if your culture is mainly East Asian, you will tend to choose cow and the grass. And you will say, well, of course, cows eat grass. It's obvious, yeah. If you've got a Western or a strongly Western cultural influence, you will say chicken and cow. And you will say, of course, they go together because they are both animals. Fascinating, eh? So in a reasonable number of studies that have been done, it would appear that East Asians will choose things that focus perhaps on the relationship between items, and Westerners will tend to focus on what the objects are and how we identify the objects and how we categorize the objects. So I'd like you to take a pause on this video anytime you want to think about the meaning of this particular slide. First off, we've got different ideas here. We've got Western and Asian, or Asian and Western. We will look at trying to define those a little bit more later. Obviously, Western is a huge group, and Asian is also a huge group. Probably what we're talking more about on this video is East Asian, and the groups are very, very big, and please remember that what we're talking about is generalization. Yeah, so general ideas. We know that there are many differences within cultures, there are many differences within Asia, and there are many differences in the West. But just coming back to this now, so on your screen you can see an in-group and an out-group. Now, the in-group is the group of people that you feel you have a relationship with. So family, friends, maybe co-workers, that sort of thing. The people that you feel that you have some identity with, if you like. The out-group is a group of people that you don't feel you have a relationship with. Yeah, and they could be people that you regard as distant or different. So they could be people from another city, another culture, another country, another religion, any one of those things. Now you'll notice that the two groups, so we've got the Asian group and we've got the Western group, you will notice a couple of things. One is that the sense of self, your sense of self, which is your sense of identity, so who you are. In the East Asian or Asian group, that sense of self is part of the in-group. Yeah, a significant part of the in-group. In the Western model, that sense of self is kind of on the edge of that group. You will also notice that the in-group and the out-group in the Asian cultural view are quite far apart. You will notice that the in-group and the out-group in the Western cultural view are quite close together. Now, the big question that we need to ask ourselves is, why is this the case? Why is it that different cultures have different measures of the identity of one person? And how is it that different cultures have a sense that they are different or distant from other groups? So good for us to learn, and especially as educationalists, it's really important to recognize that in an international world, there are many, many different ways that cultures look at the world and look at this sense of self. We have great thinkers like Hofstadter who look at different cultures and describe all sorts of relationships within those cultures which make them quite distinct. But enough for the moment. If you like, you can pause the slide and think on this. In the world, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different cultures. Now, cultures are all different ways of writing our own prescription, if you like, for what the world is, who we are in the world, where we're going, our sense of purpose, and all the little things that we do to make our lives meaningful, make our lives make sense. So in what we're looking at in this video is we're looking at two very, very broadly described groups. One is Westerners, and that's really mainly American or North American members of the British Commonwealth. But of course, within the British Commonwealth, there are also many other cultures, but that's Westerners generally. Now, if you're looking at Asians in this, largely speaking, we're talking about East Asian, so Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And we're looking at the differences that those two groups normally present with. When I say normally, we have to recognize, we must recognize that there are big differences within cultures. Cultures have tendencies, but what we're talking about here is not concrete. Yeah, it's not firm, fixed rules, because we know that cultures change. We know that cultures are defined or developed by history and geography and many other things, but cultures are continually evolving. But for the purposes of this video, we're saying we're talking about largely Westerners and East Asians. On your screen, you will see an object on your left. It's cone shape and it's made of cork. On your right, you will see a cone shape and something made of cork. Yeah, so the object on your left is Dax. The question for you is, which of the things on the right is Dax? Now you can pause that video for a moment now if you like to think about that, and then we'll get to the answer. Okay. I'm going to assume that you've had enough time to pause and think about that, and let's go with the answer. Now, you will notice that the object on the left is cone shaped. Yeah? And what Westerners will tend to do is they will identify the cone on the right as being Dax. What East Asians will tend to do is that they will look at that wheel shape, that tire shape on the right, and say that that is Dax. Why? Why do we do that? Very, very interesting question. We can explore that a little bit more, but it would appear that in the Western mindset, we look at things in isolation. We look at objects, we try to define objects, we think about nouns, we think about what things are. In an East Asian mindset, we look at what things have in common in terms of substance. So what's the relationship between the object on the left and the object on the right? The relationship is that they are both made of cork. You will notice on your screen that there are two pairs of pictures. There's A and B and C and D. Now, A and B and C and D, they're different. Yeah. And probably what you're doing right now is trying to find the difference. What we're doing now is not the same as the experiment, but in this experiment, when it was run, people from America and people from Japan, so representing Westerners and East Asians, they were shown the pictures in sequence, so first A, then B, or first C and then D, and they were asked, what is the difference, or what did you notice? Now, what the experimenters discovered was that when Americans looked at picture A and then picture B, they noticed changes in the central image. So they were very good at identifying the central idea and the central focus and changes that occurred there. The Americans were better, not a lot, but a bit better than the Japanese in that. The Japanese, in contrast, were much better at noticing changes around the outside. So the Japanese were better at paying more attention to the context. So in other words, when they looked at a picture, they tended to look all around the picture and tended to pay a lot of attention to everything around the picture. The Americans tended to focus and pay more attention to the central image. And of course, once again, the question is why? Why is it that a Western culture represented by Americans focus on the key central issue and an East Asian worldview focuses on the context? One more example, and there are many, many examples of experiments that have been done to show that different cultures actually view the world quite differently. And that how we view the world affects strongly how we think, even how we see things. There are many, but this is a nice simple example, and in this example there's a rod, which is a long thin piece of wood or metal, and there's a frame like that. Yeah, and the idea is that the frame will be moved like this or like that, and that when you're looking at it, you need to decide, is the rod still straight up and down? Yeah, so is it hanging straight down, or is it not hanging straight down? Is it off to one side? Now, in this experiment, when the frame was moved like this, Westerners, or Americans in this case, were good at deciding if the rod was still hanging straight down. East Asians were not. East Asians, generally speaking, when the frame was moved, they were what is called field dependent. So in other words, when the context changed, it became very difficult for them to decide if the rod was hanging straight down. I know that doesn't sound all that fascinating, but what it is saying is that when you think about things and you're heavily influenced by context or field, you may not see them as accurately as someone who is field independent. I'm sure you have been thinking about the origins of the different cultures and probably will continue to think more about that. One interesting way of looking at it is the geography of China versus the geography of Greece. Now, I'm not saying that this is a perfect description, but it may go some way to clarifying the differences in terms of the origins of why we think differently. So Chinese geography is a fairly large amount of flat, good quality soil and ease of traveling over distance and rice. Yeah, when you put all of those together, People can cooperate over distance, and they need to cooperate over distance if they're going to grow rice. So it's very likely, it seems likely, that a rice-based culture does tend to contribute to a sense of connection and cooperation in our social order and in terms of how we think. The Greeks, on the other hand, were an island nation, and in that island nation, so small nation, they had to solve all sorts of problems to do with trade and food and warfare. The problems that they had were best solved by having individuals who would make individual effort to solve things. So the brave individual soldier was very important. The farmer could in fact be one of a small group in a particular area, because you did not need lots of people to have goats or lots of people to have olives. Not necessary at all. So there was an opportunity within that for the individual to determine how the society functioned. So just an interesting difference there, that the geography of each of those countries was significant in terms of the development of their cultures. When we think about the Greeks and we think about objects, we know that the Greeks were very particular about defining objects exactly. So looking at the unique identity, the unique characteristics of an object. Strangely, in the same way that they came to look at people. So people had singular identity, singular characteristics, and objects were the same. In a Chinese worldview, objects are part of a bigger group. They have a substance in the same way that we looked at cork earlier. They have a substance that is connected to many other different things. So Chinese thought was looking at the relationship between objects and how objects were all part of something else. So quite a big difference in the thought process there. The other interesting point and quite fascinating one is that while East Asian thought led to all sorts of inventions, creations, and ideas, whether those are philosophical or otherwise, Western thought also had its own philosophical developments, but their main outcome, if you like, was logic. Now, the Greeks were very interested in whether something was logical or not. And their number one principle was what they called the principle of non-contradiction. So something could not be A and not A. So something could not be a cat and not a cat. To the Greeks, that was like, oh, that cannot happen. And very interestingly, that meant that the identity was singular and defined. But in an East Asian worldview, something can be A or not A depending on the context. So quite a radically different view of things. And of course, these different views of things led to differences in how we approach thinking, and interestingly, differences in how we approach medicine. A very fine example of cultural difference, as in a difference in how we think, is displayed in medicine. So in a Western medical context, I mean, obviously there's a very, very long history of medical intervention, the use of medications to help people get better and so on, and many different theories about what causes of problems are. But one of the key things that you will find in Western medicine is the operation, as in doctors using knives to open bodies and try to fix problems by intervening directly when there is a problem. So that whole idea of taking the thing and finding the problem within it is a very Western idea. So surgery is very Western. East Asian medicine never had surgery, never focused on opening an individual to find the problem and solve it. What East Asian medicine did was think about what can you do to stop that problem from happening. So what can you do in terms of foods that you eat, herbs that you eat, choices that you make in your lifestyle? What things can you do there that will help you be a healthier person? So radically different. The Western approach to medicine was about intervention for particular problems in an individual. The East Asian approach was a much more broad, which was what is it in the context that you can change to make the individual healthier. Very interesting, this point. And this point is about what is identity for different cultures. Now, we know that Westerners, generally speaking, have a relatively fixed notion of what their identity is. And it would appear that for a Westerner to be a particular thing and to have an identity that is fixed is very important. It would appear for Asians it's not so important, that that identity can quite easily and rapidly change according to the group that you're in. A Westerner changes group, he tries to bring his identity with him. An Asian changes group, he or she quite rapidly is happy with changing the identity in that group. Now, if we look at problem solving in the different groups, Asians tend to negotiate in order to find a solution that everyone is happy with. Westerners may, in fact, when there is a problem, they may focus on logic, they may focus on argument, and they're not so much concerned about whether other people agree with them. Some people say this goes back to the days before the Greeks, but in Greek culture, if you were a soldier, you could disagree with the emperor, and it was completely okay if you were logical. So if you had a logical point, then you had complete right to say that to anyone regardless of their position. So we have flexibility versus fixedness in identity as the difference between the two groups, a difference in approach to problem solving, and a difference in approach to authority. In East Asian cultural context, the relationship with authority is regarded as important. In a Western context, that relationship is something that can be discussed, argued with, or renegotiated. So some very interesting things there about the differences between the two groups. How much control you want over your destiny, your life, or your future is determined to a degree by your culture. If you are East Asian, you're reasonably okay if you don't have a lot of control over what you're doing and where you're going. And that's probably because you regard yourself as part of a group, and that group destiny, if you like, the group sense of where it is going is more important than your own. But in a Western cultural context, individuals want to be more in control of their destiny and feel that they are. And if they're not in control, then they feel not so happy about it. A nice example of this might be schools and books. So if you have a group of Western children in your classroom and you want them to do more reading, you will say to them, here are the books, Please choose one. Yeah. And the child will very happily choose a book and feel that it's valuable because they have decided and they're going to read it. Now, the irony is that if you said to your children, possibly, if you said to your children, here are some books, please read one, the child might say to you, which one should I read? Yeah, because the expectation is that choice for them is not important, that you are the expert, you are the guide, and your choice is more important than their own. Imagine that you hear of one man who did something wrong. Yeah, one man who perhaps killed someone very sadly, and you respond to that. So you talk about it. It would appear that people with a Western perspective or an American perspective will think about that person's motivation, about their personality, about who they normally are, and because of who they normally are, why they committed the crime. Yeah, that would be a very Western approach to the description of a crime. East Asians will tend to think of the context. So what was it in that person's life? What was it in that situation? What was it in the context of that crime that made the crime happen? So in one group, in the Western group, they will attribute the cause to the person. There is a tendency in an East Asian view to attribute the cause to the context. Our big question is, given what we know about different cultures and how different cultures approach things, how should that affect how we teach in class? How should it affect how we teach language? So here we are as language teachers. Fundamentally, we're teaching a language from another culture. Should we, in looking at that language from another culture, should we teach it in the way in which that culture thinks and works, or should we teach it in the way that we think and work? It's a difficult question, isn't it? That the approaches that we have in an East Asian classroom mean that the teacher is very much the model. The teacher is very much the person who controls the relationship, and the children have a very strong respect relationship with that teacher. The teacher feels that in order for the class to function well, the teacher should lead it. The teacher should control it. The teacher should direct it. And that's perfectly okay. There's a small problem in that if the teacher does do what is an East Asian approach to teaching, which is teacher-centered and teacher-led, then we don't get the opportunity for the kids within the classroom to communicate with one another, to develop language that we need them to develop if we want them to be fluent language speakers. So a challenge for you as a teacher is to consider that if you are teaching your kids, what's the best combination of the traditional approach in East Asia, and the traditional approach obviously works well with a focus on memorization, understanding, reflection, and questioning. That traditional approach works well, works particularly well for subjects that are related to science. It may not work so well for subjects that are related to language. So it may be that when it comes to developing fluency in our kids, we need to do both. We need to keep some of the strengths of the East Asian approach. So of course, lots of memorization, lots of testing, no problem with that at all. But see if you can blend into that the opportunity for your kids to talk with one another, to cooperate with one another in order to acquire fluency in English. As teachers, we think a lot about the future. We think about the culture that we have received from our ancestors from many different cultures and how that culture will affect our teaching now and also affect our future. We don't need to worry too much because cultures change. Cultures always have changed and they always will change. The culture that we are giving our learners is their ability to speak another language, because when they get the ability to speak another language, they actually learn to think in a different way. So that's the tremendous gift that you're making to your children.